They never announced its construction. There was no groundbreaking ceremony, no contracts filed in public records, no newspaper articles describing its purpose. In fact, according to every official map printed after 1954, this prison never existed at all. And yet, men were sent there. Some for crimes, some for speaking, some for being inconvenient, and some, according to the few surviving documents, for no recorded reason whatsoever. The first mention of the prison doesn't come from a government archive. It comes from a letter. A folded, water-stained page discovered in the false bottom of a filing cabinet during a demolition in Eastern Europe. No return address, no signature, just a date and a sentence written so faintly it almost disappears into the paper. If you are reading this, they have already erased us. The letter goes on to describe a place that does not match any known facility. A prison without a name. A prison without coordinates. A prison built where maps went blank. The writer never calls it a prison. He calls it the place where sound goes to die. The map that was rewritten. Before the prison existed, the land did. An unremarkable stretch of terrain, forest, rock, and marshland near a rail junction that once connected 3 countries. Old maps show a village nearby. Census records list families, births, deaths. Then, in a single year, the village vanishes. Not abandoned, not destroyed by war, simply removed. Later editions of maps replace the area with empty green shading. No labels, no roads. The railway bends around it like it's avoiding something. Surveyors who questioned the change were reassigned. One resigned. Another disappeared from payroll records entirely. By the time new cartographers were trained, the blank space became normal, as if it had always been there. That blank space became the perfect location. The transports. Prisoners never arrived during the day. They were moved at night in sealed train cars with no windows and no markings. Survivors described the journey as endless, not because it was long, but because time behaved strangely. Watches stopped. Clocks ran backward. Some prisoners swore the train never slowed, yet somehow arrived. When the doors opened, the air smelled wrong. Not rot, not metal, but something damp and ancient, like a cave that had learned to breathe. The guards never spoke. Their uniforms bore no insignia. Their faces were partially obscured by shadow even under floodlights. Prisoners later claimed they could never remember the guards' features clearly, as if their minds refused to hold on to them. The first rule was enforced immediately. No screaming. The second rule followed seconds later. Screams will continue anyway.
Architecture of control. The prison was not built like others. No central yard, no visible watchtowers, no windows facing outward. Instead, the structure descended. Corridors sloped downward at angles that made walking uncomfortable. Walls curved subtly, preventing prisoners from seeing more than a few meters ahead. Corners were rounded, not for safety, but to eliminate blind spots. Cells were stacked vertically, not horizontally. 6 levels below ground, each level quieter than the last. The deeper you were sent, the fewer people you saw. By level 5, silence became physical. Prisoners described pressure in their ears, like descending underwater. Some bled from the nose without explanation. Others felt compelled to whisper apologies to no one. And below level 6, there was no official designation, only a phrase used by guards in internal memos: the sound containment zone. The first screams. The screaming did not begin immediately. For the first few weeks, prisoners reported an unsettling calm. No shouting, no breakdowns, no violence. Then, one night, someone screamed. Not a yell, not a cry for help. A sustained animal sound that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of human lungs. It echoed, not down the corridors, but through the walls. The scream lasted 11 minutes. Then it stopped. Guards entered the cell in silence. No report was filed. The prisoner's name was removed from the intake ledger. But the scream did not disappear. Others began hearing it late at night, faint at first, like a memory replaying itself. Then clearer, closer. Soon, prisoners realized something impossible. The scream moved. It passed through levels, through locked doors, through solid concrete, and it always sounded the same. Same pitch, same rhythm, same ending breath, no matter how many times it was heard. The rule about listening. After the third week of screams, a new rule was issued verbally. Do not listen. No explanation. Prisoners who covered their ears reported less distress. Those who tried to identify the source didn't last long. One man, a former radio engineer, attempted to map the scream's movement by timing echoes. He stopped eating, stopped blinking. When guards entered his cell, they found his mouth open mid-word. His vocal cords were torn. Autopsy reports list cause of death as self-inflicted vocal trauma. No one believes that. The night recordings. This is where the prison begins to bleed into the real world. In the late 1960s, a nearby broadcast station began picking up interference during overnight hours. Low-frequency noise, distorted human sounds. Engineers assumed it was atmospheric until they slowed the audio. The sound, once filtered, revealed screaming, not random screaming, structured screaming, repeating patterns, intervals, pauses where breath should be. One technician reported recognized the scream. He had been stationed near the rail junction years earlier. He resigned the next day. The recordings were confiscated within hours of being logged, but copies survived, and they all end the same way, with a voice, hoarse, damaged, barely human, whispering something just before the signal cuts. A sentence spoken in multiple languages. A sentence prisoners later reported hearing whispered directly into their ears at night. It's louder when you remember. The first escape attempt. Officially, no one ever escaped. Unofficially, one man made it out far enough to be seen. He emerged near the old village site at dawn, barefoot, bleeding, and screaming. Locals described his mouth moving long after sound stopped coming out. When authorities arrived, the man was already dead. His lungs were intact, his throat was intact, but his ears were destroyed from the inside. Pressed against the roof of his mouth, examiners found something carved in the flesh. 3 words, written backwards, so they could only be read in a mirror. It is still screaming.
No official blueprints of the prison survive. What exists instead are fragments, partial schematics recovered from burned archives, notes scribbled in margins, and testimony from engineers who later denied ever working on the structure. All of them agree on one thing. The prison was not designed to hold people. It was designed to hold sound. Level 1. Intake. Level 1 was almost merciful. Cells were lit. Food arrived on schedule. Guards responded, rarely but consistently. Prisoners believed this was the prison. They were wrong. Level 1 existed to normalize captivity, to make later levels feel like punishment rather than purpose. People who cooperated stayed here. People who asked questions did not. Level 2. Disorientation. Stairs descended at irregular heights. Lights flickered just long enough to distort depth perception. Some prisoners misjudged steps and fell. Others developed vertigo that never left. Here, sound changed. Footsteps echoed too long. Voices returned slightly altered, half a second delayed, pitch shifted downward. Prisoners began to report the sensation of being answered when they spoke, not verbally, but through pressure, through vibration in the chest, through a hum that followed certain words. The guards never corrected this belief. Level 3. Observation. Level 3 introduced microphones. They were everywhere, embedded in walls, hidden in drain covers, suspended from ceilings disguised as ventilation. Prisoners were told the microphones monitored behavior. Internal documents revealed the opposite. They were not recording speech. They were recording silence, specifically how long it took for silence to break. Subjects who maintained silence longest were transferred downward. Those who spoke excessively were kept here until their voices failed. One prisoner reportedly screamed for 3 days straight. When his voice finally broke, the microphones registered a spike. He was removed immediately, transferred to a level no intake ledger acknowledged. Level 4. The shift. This was where prisoners began to change. Sleep deprivation became constant. Lights never fully turned off, but never fully on. People reported dreaming while awake. Some heard loved ones calling their names through the walls. Others heard their own voices speaking words they didn't remember saying. Medical staff, if they could be called that, conducted routine throat inspections. They were not checking for injury. They were checking for resonance. Prisoners whose vocal cords vibrated differently when spoken to were marked. A chalk symbol appeared on their cell doors overnight. By morning, they were gone. Level 5. Silence enforcement. No shouting reached Level 5, not because it was forbidden, because no one could do it anymore. The air was thicker here, heavy with a low-frequency pressure that made breathing feel intentional, like something you had to remember how to do. Prisoners communicated by tapping. At first, then the taps started answering back. Not randomly, perfectly mimicked. Same rhythm, same pauses, always delayed by exactly 1 second.
Some prisoners tried to trick it, changed patterns, missed beats. The response never failed. Eventually, people stopped tapping. Silence here was no longer absence, it was presence. The document called The Necessity of Screaming. This is where intent becomes undeniable. A classified report, unsigned, undated, details the prison's true function. The opening line reads, "Sound is the only thing that proves a human is still inside the body." The document outlines an experiment, not interrogation, not punishment, but extraction. The goal was to determine whether human identity could be separated from physical form using sustained auditory trauma. Screams were not a side effect, they were the medium. According to the report, prolonged exposure to a specific frequency of human distress caused measurable distortions in spatial perception. Walls flexed, distances shortened, rooms expanded without construction. Reality responded. Level 6, the source. Officially, level 6 was the lowest level. It was also where the screaming was loudest. Cells here had no doors, just openings. Prisoners were placed inside and left facing the wall. They were never spoken to again. The screams heard throughout the prison originated here, but not from the prisoners themselves. Audio analysis of recovered recordings reveals something horrifying. The screams overlapped perfectly, dozens of voices layered into one continuous sound. Not individuals screaming, a system screaming. The sound containment zone. Below level 6, the architecture changed. Corridors became smooth, almost organic. Walls curved inward, narrowing into chambers shaped like throats. This area does not appear on any blueprint. It only appears in guard testimony, always reluctantly, always with visible distress. Guards described machines that were not machines, structures that pulsed when screams reached certain volumes, lights that dimmed in response to pitch, and something at the center. Not a person, not an object, a space, an absence that reacted violently to sound. When the screams reached their peak, the space expanded. When it quieted, it contracted. One guard wrote, "It learns. It prefers certain voices." The disappearing prisoners. This explains the missing intake records. Some prisoners were not executed, they were absorbed, transferred into the screaming itself. The sound never changed because it wasn't repeating, it was accumulating. Each scream added to the whole. Each voice trapped, stretched, and flattened into the frequency the prison required. This is why the scream never aged, why it always sounded the same, why it followed prisoners. It wasn't moving, they were moving closer to it. The failed shutdown. At some point, someone tried to stop it. Power fluctuations, emergency evacuations, orders to seal lower levels permanently. Concrete was poured, steel plates welded, entire corridors collapsed intentionally. None of it worked. The screaming continued, louder after each attempt, because sound, once trapped, does not die, it waits. The maps were erased afterwards. The prison wasn't removed because it failed, it was erased because it succeeded. The blank space on the map wasn't an absence, it was a warning. Cartographers were told not to draw what could not be contained, and sound, once given a place to live, does not stay put.
The first reports did not come from inside the prison. They came from the towns that were never supposed to notice it. Villages miles away, places with no recorded connection to the blank area on the map, began filing complaints that made no sense on paper. People heard noises at night, not loud enough to wake them fully, not quiet enough to be dreams. A distant, layered sound, like wind moving through a throat. Local authorities blamed pipes, animals, old buildings settling, but the reports continued, and then they synchronized. The night everyone woke up. On a single night, documented in at least 4 separate regions, entire households woke at the exact same time. 2:17 a.m. Clocks stopped afterward. People described sitting upright in bed, heart racing, convinced someone had called their name, but no voice had. What they heard instead was pressure, a vibration deep in the chest, identical to the sensation prisoners described on level 5. Infants began screaming first, then dogs, then adults. One witness wrote, "It felt like the night was breathing through us." The scream without a mouth. Inside the prison, guards noticed something worse. Cells on level 4 began registering sound spikes without any corresponding movement. Microphones detected screams, cameras showed prisoners sitting still, mouths closed, throats unmoving, eyes wide, yet the screaming was real, measured, recorded, analyzed. Doctors performed examinations and found vocal cords intact and unused. The sound was not coming from the body, it was coming through it. One internal memo states, "Subjects no longer need to produce sound, they have become resonant chambers." The mirror cells. To study this phenomenon, a new experiment began. Certain prisoners were moved into specially constructed cells lined with polished metal. Not mirrors, something closer to acoustic reflectors. When screams passed through these cells, they bent, split, returned. Prisoners inside began reacting to sounds before they occurred, flinching seconds early, covering ears before any noise registered. Some began speaking answers to questions no one had asked. Others whispered numbers, always the same sequence, always stopping 1 digit short. No document explains what the numbers meant, only that staff stopped writing them down. The town that heard the prison. 10 kilometers from the blank space, a town began to change. Residents reported hearing humming beneath conversations. Church services were interrupted by unexplained echoes. People started pausing mid-sentence, confused, as if listening to something else. Then the screaming began. Not everywhere, only in enclosed spaces, bathrooms, basements, cars with the windows closed. Doctors diagnosed mass hysteria, until one physician recognized the sound. He had treated a former rail worker years earlier, a man who woke every night screaming about a prison that didn't exist. The physician listened to a recording from the town, then destroyed it, then himself. The broadcast incident. The prison never intended to transmit, but sound, once accumulated, seeks release.
Late one night, a regional emergency broadcast interrupted all radio frequencies for 11 seconds. No warning tone, no message, just screaming, layered, compressed, perfectly structured. Engineers later discovered the frequency matched the interference recorded decades earlier. The same scream, now stronger, now clearer, now reaching far beyond the forest. The broadcast ended with a whisper, not the same sentence as before, a new one. We learned how to leave. The guards who couldn't stop listening. After the broadcast, guards began reporting symptoms identical to prisoners: nosebleeds, auditory hallucinations, the sensation of being called from below. Some removed their ear protection, some smashed recording equipment. A few descended into the lower levels without orders. They were never seen again. Cameras showed them stopping at the threshold of the sound containment zone, standing still, listening, then stepping forward. The prison's new function. Internal command realized too late. The prison was no longer containing sound, it was training it. Each scream refined the frequency, each voice improved transmission, each listener became a potential relay. The prison did not need walls anymore. It had learned how to imprint itself onto people. Anyone who heard it long enough carried it with them, like an echo that refused to fade. The final experiment. A decision was made. If the prison could broadcast, it could be overloaded. They gathered every remaining prisoner, every functioning microphone, every resonant chamber. They ordered one final scream. Not chaos, not panic, but synchronized human terror, channeled, amplified, focused. The goal was to collapse the sound containment zone inward, to bury the absence beneath its own noise. Witnesses described the sound as unbearable. Equipment shattered, lights exploded, concrete cracked. For a moment, the screaming stopped. Complete silence. Then something new happened. The silence screamed back. What escaped? After that night, no more guards entered the lower levels. Maps were rewritten, files destroyed, the railway rerouted. The prison was sealed not because it was empty, but because it was full of sound that no longer needed walls.
After the prison was sealed, officials told themselves the danger was contained. They were wrong in the most fundamental way possible. You can seal concrete, you can erase maps, you can burn records, but you cannot imprison sound once it has learned an audience. The first carriers. The first people to leave were not prisoners. They were staff, guards, technicians, medical personnel, anyone who had spent extended time below level 3. They were discharged quietly. No ceremonies, no documentation, no debriefings. Just train tickets, severance pay, and instructions never to speak about what they heard. Within weeks, symptoms appeared: night terrors, bleeding ears without trauma, the sensation of pressure when entering enclosed rooms. One former guard reported that his apartment screamed only when the lights were off. Another said the sound lived in his wardrobe. A technician claimed the screaming stopped if he hummed along with it. He was later found dead with his mouth open mid-note. The contagion of listening.
The prison did not spread through contact, it spread through attention. People who tried to ignore the sound suffered longer. People who acknowledged it, who listened closely, experienced clarity first, then collapse. Doctors called it a mass psychogenic illness. Neurologists blamed auditory cortex damage. None could explain why symptoms passed from person to person without physical proximity. One nurse began hearing the scream after treating a former guard. A teacher developed it after a student described it in detail. A journalist caught it while transcribing an interview and realized too late that the scream existed between the words. The children who never knew silence. Years later, something worse emerged. Children were born hearing it. Not all of them, only those whose parents had been exposed. Infants who could not sleep in quiet rooms. Toddlers who screamed when soundproofed. Children who covered their ears when adults whispered. When questioned, some described the noise simply, "It's the inside sound." Pediatric hearing tests showed nothing abnormal, but recordings made near these children picked up faint interference, the same layered frequency, the same scream, lower in volume, waiting. The houses that learned. Entire neighborhoods became unstable. Residents reported sounds that followed floor plans rather than people, hallways that amplified whispers, bathrooms where silence pressed inward. One apartment block was evacuated after residents independently reported hearing screaming from different walls, each describing the sound as coming from the center of the building. Acoustic engineers discovered something impossible. The structure itself had become resonant, as if the walls remembered, as if the prison's architecture had imprinted itself onto other spaces. The prison was no longer a location, it was a pattern. The return of the numbers. Those numbers prisoners whispered on level 4 began appearing again. Children muttered them in sleep. Former staff wrote them obsessively in notebooks. The sequence was always the same, always stopping one digit short. Attempts to complete the sequence resulted in immediate distress, nosebleeds, vomiting, loss of consciousness. One mathematician recognized the pattern. It was not a code, it was a count of voices, and it was increasing. The people who wanted to go back. Some carriers experienced something unexpected, longing. They missed the silence, described silence as unbearable, like pressure without release. A support group formed unofficially. They met in basements, in tunnels, in abandoned buildings, places where the scream felt closer. They said it made them feel complete, whole, as if part of them had been missing before they heard it. One former prisoner, released early due to administrative error, told them the truth. The prison wasn't punishing them, it was keeping them alive, holding something worse at bay. The dream of the door. Across countries and decades, carriers reported the same dream. A corridor sloping downward, walls curving, a door without a handle. Behind it, silence so dense it felt violent. Every dream ended the same way. The door opened inward, and the screaming stopped. People woke crying, not in fear, in grief. The failed cures. Governments attempted intervention, white noise generators, sound therapy, total sensory deprivation. None worked. In isolation tanks, patients heard the scream louder. In anechoic chambers, they lasted minutes before begging to be released. One subject clawed at the walls, screaming, "It needs us to hear it." Eventually, the programs were defunded, officially abandoned, unofficially continued in smaller, quieter facilities. Why silence became dangerous? The final realization came too late. Silence was never neutral. Silence was space, and the prison had taught something to fill it. The scream didn't exist to torture. It existed to anchor, to hold something vast and formless in place. As the scream spread thinner, distributed across millions of listeners, the anchor weakened. People began reporting moments of total quiet, followed by overwhelming dread, as if something had slipped, as if the scream was no longer loud enough to hold it back.
What the prison was holding back. The truth did not come from the prison. It came from places that existed long before it. The older blueprints. When archivists finally compared the prison's design to unrelated historical sites, a pattern emerged that no one wanted to acknowledge. The downward-sloping corridors, the curved walls, the throat-shaped chambers. They were not modern. They were ancient. Neolithic structures in northern Europe, subterranean temples in Anatolia, burial complexes beneath vanished cities in Central Asia, all shared the same geometry, all lacked written explanation, and all were associated with one recurring phrase in fragmented translations: the place where noise keeps the dark asleep. The first silence events. Long before the prison was built, there were records of what happened when the sound stopped. Not screaming, silence. Villages where birds vanished overnight. Caves explorers fled without injury, yet never spoke again. Temples abandoned after priests reported the gods had gone quiet. In every case, witnesses described the same sensation, not fear, attention, as if something noticed it was no longer being distracted. Why screaming worked. The prison did not invent the scream, it industrialized it. Ancient cultures used drums, chants, human voices layered into ritual noise that lasted days. Not worship, containment. The sound created friction in reality, distortion, vibration, interference, enough to keep something vast and listening from focusing. The prison replaced ritual with machinery, replaced ceremony with suffering, but the function remained the same. The shape in the absence. Recovered footage from the sound containment zone, never officially released, shows something that should not be visible. When the screaming dropped below a certain threshold, the air bent. Not heat distortion, perspective distortion. Straight lines curved inward, depth collapsed, and at the center of the chamber, the absence reacted. Not violently, curiously, as if testing the boundary, as if deciding whether it could fit. What it is not. It is not a demon, not an entity, not alive in any way humans understand. It does not hunt. It does not want. It waits. It exists where sound should be and isn't. A pressure behind existence, a reminder that silence is not empty. It is unfinished. The scream was never meant to hurt prisoners. It was meant to keep the silence uneven. The final misunderstanding. The prison failed because humans tried to control the process. They measured,
They optimized, they reduced the scream to efficiency. In doing so, they removed what ancient rituals understood instinctively. The scream had to be unresolved, imperfect, human. When the prison synchronized it, purified it, flattened it into a stable frequency, it weakened it. The scream became predictable, and what waited in silence learned its shape. The moment it almost came through. There is one last classified incident, a night when the scream dropped to 0, less than 3 seconds. Every carrier across the world felt it simultaneously. People stopped breathing, animals froze, electronics shut down without damage. Those 3 seconds are described by the same way in every report, like something leaned forward. Then the screaming returned, faint, scattered, carried by millions of throats that didn't know they were screaming yet. Why the prison can never be reopened. Going back would concentrate the sound again, make it strong, make it loud, but also make it targetable. The prison taught silence where to look, so now the scream must remain diffuse, imperfect, carried in whispers, in hums, in tinnitus, in the discomfort people feel when a room is too quiet. The prison still exists, not underground, in people. The final warning. There is one reason these records are still classified, not because the truth is frightening, but because once you understand the function, you might try to stop the screaming, turn off the noise, seek perfect silence. And that would be a mistake humanity would not survive twice.
If you're still listening, that means the screaming didn't drive you away. That matters more than you think. Most people don't notice sound until it's gone. They chase silence like it's peace, like it's safety. But after everything you've heard tonight, you know better. Silence isn't empty. It waits. Every place you've been in this story still exists somewhere, not on maps, not in records, but in the spaces where sound should be and isn't. In the quiet moments before sleep, in the low hum you can't explain, in the way a room feels wrong when it's too still. That prison was never destroyed. It was distributed. And if you felt uncomfortable at any point while listening, if the quiet felt heavier than the screaming, then you heard what others ignore. That doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means you're still listening. So tonight, when the video ends, don't rush to fill the silence. Don't turn on noise just to feel safe. Let the room breathe. Because as long as sound exists, imperfect, human, unfinished, whatever waits in the silence stays where it belongs. This is NOXHOUR. We don't tell these stories to scare you. We tell them so you'll remember. Silence is never harmless. Good night. And if you hear something after this ends, that's not us anymore.